Hello. My name is Ryan Singer, and I'm going to be moderating this panel. There's a bunch of interesting people here, a lot of entrepreneurs, engineers, and legal and policy experts. You'll probably know me from my work as a serial Bitcoin entrepreneur over the last 3 years. I founded a few companies, one that was an exchange, one that was a multi-sig vendor, and a couple that work with financial institutions. But for the purpose of this panel and of talking about how traditional regulators and decentralized groups can collaborate and work together, my more interesting experience is my last 15 years of working in enterprise open source software. And so that's I think, what I'm going to highlight as I move through here is the governance institutions that govern how we build the systems that keep us alive and help us communicate, and all of the very, very wonderful things that we do. Most of the technology we use on a day-to-day basis is entirely reliant on open source software. And it's not regulated by governments, and it's not really regulated by major corporations. They're distributed, decentralized, volunteer-run organizations that build very detailed and sophisticated governance infrastructure to decide who gets to ship code that controls the systems that operate your car and your cell phone and all of these other private systems where bad actors could do much, much worse to you than the government could. And how we're protected is through these institutions that build transparency and build trust and build reputation around the most important projects, where the people involved work continuously on enhancing the reputation of the project and enhancing their own reputation as an honest and capable contributor to the project. So that's kind of the perspective I'm bringing as we come here. We're going to go down the line, and each person's going to spend a minute or two introducing themselves, and then I'll lead a discussion and take questions whenever we slow down.
So I'm Sian Jones. I'm a regulatory compliance consultant, predominantly here in the UK, but also in the other EU member states and in the Isle of Man. I'm co-lead of the Regulation and Banking Group of the UK Digital Currency Association, and I'm also founder of something called EDCAB, which is the European Digital Currency and Blockchain Technology Forum, which is a public policy platform that's facing out to the European Commission and the European Parliament and the other EU institutions.
Peter Todd, I do Bitcoin core development as well as consulting related to that, and not just Bitcoin itself, but also a lot of blockchain projects beyond that.
Hi, I'm Amor Sexton. I'm a solicitor in Sydney, or a lawyer, for those of you who don't have solicitors. I've also been involved with liaising with regulators, policymakers, law enforcement officers around the world to discuss a number of different things, not just what the regulatory framework should look like, but to have a discussion about how we're actually defining the different uses of the technology, how it's manifesting itself in the commercial world. And my focus has really been on trying to find synergies, identify friction points, and then look at whether or not there is, we can propose some frameworks that might be able to mitigate the risks that are quite obviously there, but also create an environment that still facilitates innovation.
Hi everyone, I'm Pamela Morgan. I'm an attorney at Empowered Law, but now I spend my time as the CEO of Third Key Solutions. And Third Key Solutions is a multi-signature company focused on allowing self-governance through multi-sig technology within companies and organizations. Additionally, I also just accepted a position with the Cryptocurrency Certification Consortium, which is a nonprofit based out of Canada that is developing industry standards by way of the community. And there are open community standards that are available right now. If you're interested in the CCSS standards, please take a look at them, and I'll be happy to send you a link.
Hi everybody, I'm a mere functionary of the UK Digital Currency Association. I'm told I'm a volunteer as well. I was a founding member of the association, and I've been running the political engagement program. So that consists of targeting MPs and Lords in the UK and briefing them in a sort of collaborative way about what the impact of this technology is. And then that's obviously fed through to Sian's work there in the regulatory area, so that we then start covering the FCA's interests as well. I'd just like to say that I think there's a remarkable amount of alignment between government, regulators, and this community. I think it's an amount of alignment that sometimes we don't want to admit, but there is a great deal of progress we can make as a group, rather than just ourselves.
My name is David Goldstone. I'm rather awkwardly here wearing three different hats, which is not comfortable. First of all, I'm a barrister, a commercial barrister. I have a subspeciality in digital currencies, and in that capacity I try to help generally rather small companies navigate the morass and maze of EU and UK financial regulation as it applies to small startup type organisations. Sorry, I just sat forward. Secondly, I too am also on the UK DCA, and in that capacity I drafted the UK response to the New York BIC licence proposals, about which I shall say no more unless somebody wants to see me get angry. Third, I have a long-standing theoretical interest in regulation and its particular application to the financial sector from, and I will say it now, from a very old-fashioned liberal perspective, sometimes called classical liberal. And in that capacity, the view that I've formed over many years is that if you want to protect consumers and users, by far and away the best way to do it is through voluntary, private and contractual arrangements. And I will be quite frank, I am deeply sceptical of the utility and merits of the vast and overblown financial regulatory apparatus that exists as at 2015.
Great. So I'm pretty excited. This is a panel of pretty smart people. I like it when I'm not the smartest guy in the room. To get started, Peter, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how decisions are made about what gets into Bitcoin, what doesn't, how are development priorities set, who gets to decide, who has commit access, how are pull requests judged, the governance of the Bitcoin project.
I mean, I think first and foremost important point to make is that nothing happens unless people go do it voluntarily. And there's sort of two levels to that. One is, of course, Bitcoin Core as a project, is not a project where there is a defined team with a defined leader who goes and sets priorities and then the priorities happen. This is nothing like a commercial software project where there's a roadmap, there's a plan, that's set in stone, and you go do that and you go work according to a schedule. Rather, it's really based on people coming together in a community and saying, all right, I want this to happen. I will go write the code that does this, and then I will persuade other people that this is a good idea and that I've been careful enough that this will have significantly more positive benefits than negative impacts. And then, of course, the other aspect of that is even within this project, of course, we can't force people to run Bitcoin Core. Right now we have actually sort of two major forks of the Bitcoin Core source code that are being actively used, which is Bitcoin XT for Mike Hearn, and then Bitcoin replaced by Fee for myself. And they have different views on details of what should Bitcoin Core be doing. And then on top of that, then you have the notion of, well, what is the Bitcoin protocol? And the Bitcoin protocol, traditionally you would think of it as, the spec set in stone, where bunch of somehow people come to agreement what the specification is, and that's not actually how it works in Bitcoin, because nobody knows how to make spec precise enough to get all the details right. So instead, our so-called specification is a piece of code. You know, and this makes all the governance very unusual compared to most software projects. You know, there's not a company involved, there's not leaders involved, and the outcomes are very different. You know, with a Linux software distribution, if I'm running Ubuntu and you're running Kubuntu, that's totally okay. The security of your system versus my system is roughly the same. In fact, maybe a better example would be with PGP, where if I use PGP to email one person in this audience, and then everyone else was using something other than PGP to secure their email, the security I have relative to my partner is the same. Whereas in Bitcoin, the security is all about proof of work, where you have to take all the work associated with your version of this blockchain and use that to fend off an attacker. And if this room has 100 people and I'm one of 2 people using a fork, I have 50 times less security than everyone else. So if you can't come to consensus among a very wide group of people what you should do with the system, it is not secure. And because it's not secure, nobody's going to accept your, you know, Bitcoin new version Bitcoins. You know, and all this stuff kind of comes together to form a consensus model. Currently, we mostly make reasonably small changes that we can get consensus on. You know, if nobody argues that this is a bad idea, yes, we've made changes to the Bitcoin protocol, and they've all been things that are non-controversial. You know, I'm working on a change right now which says let's go add a new feature to let you lock coins until sometime in the future. And everyone thinks it's a good idea, and it'll probably happen in the next couple months.
Is there a formal process for building that consensus?
I wouldn't call it formal, precisely because how would you come to consensus over what's the formal process for coming to consensus? You know, and that's actually a very, very serious issue. You know, like we have this website, bitcoin.org, which recently made it a policy among the people who run that website, saying we will not put on this website, which is meant to be a neutral ground, any forks of Bitcoin which are contentious. And of course, the discussion soon, you know, devolved into what's the definition of contentious. Well, if you have to ask, it probably is. And that's really what it comes down to. I mean, we once fixed a bug in Bitcoin where you could make money out of thin air. Getting consensus to fix that was pretty easy. You know, there was no discussion about it. It was, what's the most obvious way to fix it? That looks good. Let's do it. Call your friends and tell them we have to do this now. But you know, bigger issues, the process around the process is hard enough to come to consensus with.
Interesting. So for the lawyers and policy experts, those of us that come from open source kind of have this background of, you know, we're posting code to these public markets, we view it as kind of technical speech. And we usually post it under open source license that disclaim liability if someone uses it for any purpose. They can use our code if they want to, but part of the license to the copyright for that code is they agree never to sue us about it. That's something that has worked reasonably well for web servers and internet routers and cell phones. But it's interesting that this is kind of the first time we've seen it be used for something in a very, very heavily regulated space, right? We have for the first time code that's being posted to the internet, that's being downloaded by individual users and run on their local computers that are competing with, you know, Fedwire and SEPA, right? That are running a real core settlement system that can really facilitate transactions between regulated financial institutions and between financial institutions and consumers. So I guess my question would be, what are the interesting considerations you think that users and companies should have while building on technology that, you know, fundamentally the development of the technology is by people that are just making speech and disclaiming liability?
Can I address a bugbear before we go down that?
Absolutely.
And that is the language that we use. I think Paul made the point earlier that I think if I think there's actually a lot of synergy between what the technology experts in the industry are trying to achieve and what, you know, even regulators and policymakers are trying to achieve. I think a lot of it is about how we communicate it, and I was just listening to what Peter was talking about, and he was using words like informal, you know, and things that kind of infer disorganisation, you know, distributed, that kind of stuff. But when you actually listen to what he's actually saying that it's self-regulating. It's a self-regulating community. And when you think about it, you can, you know, obviously you need to stress test this theory, but, you know, I would then sit down and see about what language can you use to describe that process that's going on. It is informal to a point, but it's also a lot more formal. It doesn't have board meetings where everyone's in a suit and it comes in, but the fact that it's democratic to a sense, the fact that it needs a majority, or it needs, you know, I think rather than just thinking that there is no regulation in this, that it's a completely kind of just a piece of code you can download, using language that describes that process in a way that people who are familiar with regulatory environments can understand, I think that allows the conversation to be more constructive because you can identify agreed points and disagreed points. Does that make sense?
I'd actually go and extend on that point out. You know, what I'm really talking about is the process by which we come to decide what are the rules to regulate the system. And that's one step removed from what you'd normally be talking about when you were talking about regulation. It's not people who regulate the Bitcoin blockchain, it is code. The process of deciding what those rules are can be a bit chaotic. But once those rules are in place, there's nothing chaotic about it. It's extremely deterministic, consensus, and predictable.
And I think the reason why I picked that up is because I was actually asked by, you guys call it a central bank, but I was actually asked by the equivalent in one of the jurisdictions that I was speaking to, and they asked me about the integrity of the Bitcoin system and what that process was. And the person that I heard answered it, that they answered it in language that didn't help the cause, you know. So I think you're right, what we're talking about is different, but whether we're talking about business activities and trying to build accurate risk profiles to what people are doing with the technology, or the inherent stability of the technology itself, if we can just try and understand that there's got to be some lexicons that work for both the accurate to the technology, but also describe things in a way that other people can understand.
I think we don't. We may need to make some distinctions between regulation of Bitcoin, the protocol, the stuff, and the people, the actors, and the activities of those people, conducted by those people who engage with Bitcoin and crypto stuff. With one or two exceptions, most of them failures, there really isn't much call for any kind of technology-specific regulation. And certainly within the financial services world, regulation tends to be of the actors, the market participants, and their activities. So sometimes market participants are defined by the nature of the activities, for example, exchanges. It's a very simple one. Mostly when we come into when we talk about regulation, we're really just talking about the activities of those market participants, their behaviour, their integrity, their honesty, the skill that they put into looking after other people's valuables, money, whatever. I have yet to hear, apart from the EBA, I have yet to hear of any policymaker or legislator or regulator calling for the regulation of Bitcoin, the protocol. So there are some issues, some really interesting issues that Peter's raised about the governance of the protocol, of the code, the way things happen. But in terms of where most people are looking at regulation, they're looking at it from the financial payment services industry perspective. And the the things that drive regulation there, consumer protection, public policy issues like money laundering bad and stopping terrorist financing and so on. Those are public policy issues that are focused on the people, the activities that those people conduct. It's much easier actually than one likes to think.
Just very briefly, I would suggest that the users of distributed digital currency and allied systems are really not going to be protected by giving rights to sue people like Peter Todd for writing bad software. They are going to be protected by informing themselves before trusting their money to such systems. They'll be protected by reputation, which is obviously important in this field, particularly when you're dealing with open source, where some very clever people pour through this software line by line. And certainly for my part, I'm quite happy to trust their judgments because they can do a far, far better job than I can. And then they're protected by exercising choice based on that information, in terms of what wallets they use, in terms of what protocols they choose to use. So I'm very much against, even though I'm a barrister, I'm very much against the over-litigization of those sorts of questions.
But surely it's not just the litigation, it's the existing regulations. And what we seem to have is two sort of types of regulator. There's the regulator who's got a job to regulate, and by gum, he's going to regulate. And we've got digital currencies, and obviously it looks like money and it acts like something they should regulate, so they will. And then we've got some regulators who are actually more policy-driven, I think. Regulators who realise that the original policies were for, if you like, the mainstream financial services world. And this is a new world, and they're holding back, and they're trying to learn a little bit about what this brings, good and bad. And they're waiting for the policymakers, quite rightly in my mind, to actually make new policy that encompasses what we can do with this technology. So that distributed technologies come with a great deal of useful tools in all sorts of ways of life. And they've got to, sort of get up to speed, produce the policy that the regulators then are guided by.
I think as well, if you talk about a policy approach, you can start to understand some of the driving motivations behind the regulations, and then it opens dialogue to what tools that technology may have to try and meet that. So for example, in the EBA report that we referenced earlier, they expressed a significant amount of concern about consumer protection. And there's things like continuous real-time auditing and multi-sig governance, which are regulatory tools that can be inherent into this protocol, or that can be utilised in the protocol, that could provide a level of governance within that payment system or that transaction that could actually help meet some of those policy goals. And that's exactly what, I'll let Pamela explain it more, but that's exactly what her company's doing.
Yeah, that is exactly what we've been doing, and that's exactly how I actually got into Third Key Solutions. So I was practicing as an attorney in the space, and I was asked repeatedly if I would hold a third key as part of a multi-sig. And so when I was helping startups create and develop their companies, I was asking them questions like, okay, if you're asking for investment from Bitcoin investors, how do you plan to hold it? And then that led to the question of how are we going to, can we use multi-sig as a way to secure investors' money? And the answer is yes. So if you have an investor who has Bitcoin and they want to invest, we can use multi-sig and create an address quickly, easily from your house, from your phone, from wherever. We don't need to go to an institution. And we can do this and create a multi-sig that will allow investors to become signers on the address. So not only are the investors signers on the address, but also the principals of the company and perhaps someone extra as a backup. And so sometimes we use a 3 of 5 address scheme. So we might have three people who need to sign in order to authorize the transaction out of 5 total. This is fantastic for a number of reasons. One, because an investor does not have to wait for an update from the company CEO about the health of that account. Instead, they can put a watch on the address and they'll be informed anytime that there's a transaction, whether or not their internal processes include an email or a text notification. Additionally, it provides extra transparency, and so you can see who actually used that key to sign. So within the organization, you can say, okay, Joe and Sarah and Amina all signed this transaction, and that is an excellent tool for transparency. It also helps to prevent a single bad actor within a company from embezzling funds, and then you can use this same sort of signature scheme to create capital accounts, operational accounts, as well as revenue accounts. And so you can add internal corporate governance structure, and you can actually prevent the transaction from happening. So a lot of time in regulation, we're looking in hindsight and we're saying, well, we try to prevent, but we know in reality most of the time we're working backward. This technology can actually allow us to prevent many of the bad actions before they happen, simply by way of technology.
Can you explain further as well that the situation you're describing there was really like a governance system internally, but I know that there's some companies in the industry now that are using it like authentication and verification security checks as well. How would that work externally? If you had, say you were a company and you wanted to tell your customers that you had increased security steps to make sure that the transactions that were going out, because they're irreversible, are actually verified. How would that work?
Sure. So one of our primary businesses that we focus on is helping exchanges. So we all know the story of Mt. Gox, and we all know the story of a single signer address and hot wallets. So an exchange will come to us and say, okay, what are our options? We're holding this much in a hot wallet, we're holding this much in cold storage, what should we do? And so then we talk about things like, okay, well, if you want to create individual accounts for customers, how are you going to do that? Are you going to use a software oracle that has maybe velocity or policy controls? So you can say, okay, any of our customers can operate within a less than $1,000 value space. Anything over $1,000 requires additional verification, and this is the verification method. So some companies are using biometrics, very few. Some of them are using SMS, they're using email, they're doing all sorts of different methods of authentication directly with the end user. And then typically there would be another backup key in cold storage. And when we're talking about cold storage, we're looking at resiliency. So can we store that key in multiple jurisdictions, in multiple geographic locations? And what is the impact of creating a robust system that can then be recreated in the event that that company goes out of business? So when we're looking at creating multi-sig solutions, we're looking at consumer protection not only for the end user consumer, but also for the business, so all of the interim steps.
Pamela and Peter and a bunch of the other entrepreneurs and technologists in this space are working on using really wonderful tools, both best practices and software for authentication, for authorization, for governance on accounts, for governance between institutions, all in a very lightweight and transparent way. Sian, I was wondering, do you think that these tools, as they get developed by the digital currency industry, will see these kinds of roles move from compliance to IT within the traditional financial sector?
Yes is a simple answer, yes. The idea, the concept of multi-sig, there's nothing new in it, it's just new in the way it's being applied. In the governance of most payment institutions and banks and even corporates, the idea of single signatories is pretty outmoded. I mean, you just don't have that. You have a number of mechanisms for setting up and releasing payments, and that's the normal way of working. So really this is just the technical solution to this, the technical answer to this, providing the same solution to the same problem of trust and governance within organisations, and also mitigating some of the risks either from external or internal attacks on the integrity of the system. So yes, I think they will be using it.
I'd go point out, and again, I share your view there, is that these systems are simply recreating what already exists from the point of view of control. Whereas a really key thing with Bitcoin is that all this stuff's voluntary. You know, if you choose not to use the systems in these ways, nobody can force you to, other than really your partners. And if you choose not to use those partners, well, you don't use those partners, which I think is very much in contrast to a lot of regulatory situations where if you're not able to be explicitly forced, at least the threats against you to go do things the way the regulations say are so extreme as to be effectively, yes, people will do it this way.
I think we will see in some jurisdictions, we will see regulations that will say if you are running an exchange or you're in some other role where you're holding other people's value, then you must have a multi-sig governance system, or you must have a particular type of cybersecurity framework, or these things will be prescribed in some jurisdictions for some actors.
Yeah, but speaking as first an engineer, I'm surrounded by lawyers, thank goodness, but speaking as an engineer, I mean, this is a very young industry. It might have been running for some years, but in terms of getting people organised and building new products, it's quite young. And you know, it's an excellent example of using multi-sig to implement regulation perhaps a better way than some companies are run or organisations. But there's a lot more to come. You know, identity in terms of regulators has always been done top down. Big governments from that start, giving the policymakers time to actually rethink that in a distributed environment such as Bitcoin. Not just the policymakers, but actually the engineers, you know, and start to build, for instance, identity systems from the bottom up is absolutely key. Those things will come, and when they're actually probably are here, let's say, but to be able to show a policymaker what that actually means is a very powerful thing, and it gives them a chance to actually appreciate how the policy should be reframed, so that those systems can actually make an impact on mainstream financial systems.
You know, with regard to this notion of voluntary adoption, with identity, I can give an extremely concrete example where these systems do exist and do get used, which is frequently in the Bitcoin world. Someone will want to have a pool of money to accomplish some particular purpose, and they will very frequently set up a multi-sig account where every one of the addresses that, you know, has to sign to go and unlock the funds will be referred to in a PGP signed email that in turn, you know, represents someone's identity, and that identity is then verified through the web of trust. You know, this is a very concrete bottom-up voluntary system that people use. Obviously, if you're looking at the blockchain as an external observer, you will go see meaningless numbers instead of an identity. But for the people who choose to be a part of that system and choose to, say, donate money to this multi-sig address for some cause, they have very good identity verification.
It's worth mentioning that one of the great virtues of that is that you give away your personal information only to the extent that you want to and need to. Whereas the existing regulatory framework in terms of money laundering and so on and so forth requires you in effect to give away your identity and your identity documents to faceless people who will do what they will do with it. And they may be well-meaning, but you don't really have much choice over who uses it and who gets it. And the great virtue of the sort of thing that Peter has just talked about is that you get to choose who gets it and the extent to which they get it and no more.
So I have a question for Amor. A lot of the topics that have come up in the last few minutes, trust, identity, verification, responsibility, these are things that companies like Pamela's are addressing with technology that makes it very clear up front how those things are being handled and very transparent to the consumer. But these are also the goals of the financial regulation, you know, consumer protection, making sure that these tools are being used lawfully and not unlawfully, things like that. I know you're involved in a lot of the issues trying to frame how financial regulation needs to change to keep up with this technology changing. How can we frame that in a way where we can restore trust in our public institutions that's been so badly damaged by things like the American government losing all this private information for their employees, or Target losing all of the credit card numbers?
I think trust in public institutions is the level of trust in public institutions does change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I think that's just probably worth pointing out, because it's very hard to have a global dialogue and not mention that. And I'll give you an example. So in Australia, it's actually not particularly onerous to become fully compliant with the Financial Services Licensing Act. So there was a race in the Bitcoin industry to become licensed. There are a lot of people who are trying to do it. And what's happening, ironically, is that the Australian regulator is saying, no, we don't want to give you a license, we don't regulate you. In Australia, you have an activities-based, conduct-based approach to regulation. So Bitcoin itself is not regulated, but certain activities that you carry out with Bitcoin may be regulated. And this is public, this is in ASIC's submission to the Senate inquiry. They described a situation where one of the companies had, they were an exchange, but they also had an escrow function on their website. And they asked for a license for that function because the conduct meant that that was regulated conduct. And ASIC actually decided to not regulate them at all. And they made that decision because they said that licensing sends a message to consumers that there's regulatory oversight of the business. And they said that in that perspective, they would only be overseeing a small part, an incidental part of the overall business. And it was safer for consumers for this business to remain unlicensed than for them to have a license and not be fully licensed and be subject to full oversight. So I think it's probably worth mentioning, because when you look at regulatory frameworks like this, that if you look at that, then what you identify is what's in the regulator's mind, right? They want to protect consumers. They also want to, are open to a way that you could have internal self-regulation as well, or some form of self-regulation. I mean, I think that there is a general move towards deregulation of the financial markets in some jurisdictions, as long as you can show that there are other ways that you can achieve the same levels of stability and transparency. So when we're trying to frame these conversations and we take an activities risk-based approach that, to framing the regulations, that opens the conversation to these, okay, what are the activities we're carrying out? What can the businesses themselves do to try and limit the risk to those activities? And then what are the tools that, well, what are the activities that the regulators really do need to have oversight over? And then the next thing is, what are the tools that can help the regulators have oversight? So Tom Marini's continuous real-time auditing project that used, it was another use of multi-signature technology, but what that allowed was for continuous real-time auditing, not just of the financial stability or financial position of the business, but also AML auditing as well. So I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but I guess my general approach is you kind of start with the activity and then you can step through and you can look at all the things we've been talking about, which is what makes sense for consumers, what can the industry do, and then what do regulators absolutely have to look at.
So it's probably who regulates the regulator, because I mean we have a similar situation that you have, or in Australia we have a similar situation here in the UK, where the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, that would be the most likely regulator of certain activities, for example, exchange activities, rejected and consistently and continuously rejected regulating Bitcoin exchanges or wallet providers or storage providers on the grounds that although there might just be some tenuous link to an activity that is regulated, it was easier to pick on an overarching exclusion, which was that it needed to be, or an exception, which was that to be regulated it needed to be the primary activity, and the argument was that in an exchange the business of holding funds was purely incidental and not the primary activity. Interestingly enough, to kind of amplify that point, in the famous European Banking Authority, the EBA opinion that came out nearly a year ago, the famous one with identifying 70 risks and 20 risk drivers and so forth. Three, if I remember correctly, three of the risks that were identified were the risks to regulators, you can imagine. One was the risk of doing something, the other was and stifling innovation, the other was of not doing something and being, letting something happen on their watch and so on and so forth. So, yeah, the big problem for the regulators is they don't want to add their stamp of approval, or they see there's value in their stamp of approval that since they don't really understand this stuff, they'd rather find an excuse not to regulate.
So the risk to regulators is actually an interesting point that I was hoping would come up. Constance told me that the reason I was chosen to moderate this panel is I'm not afraid to be controversial. So I'm gonna throw a little bit of a hand grenade, and actually I'm gonna throw it to David first. The first thing I did in Bitcoin was I created a Wikipedia article about the Silk Road Marketplace, and it's a pretty clear example of these technologies bringing governance and transparency and consumer protection and trust to markets that the government would rather not have consumer protection and transparency and trust and quality. As these tools that are used for governance online become available increasingly to institutions that the government is not fond of, how do you think that changes the relationship between governor and governed?
Well, there's the general issue and there's the specific issue. The general issue is regulation versus self-governance. And that's an issue that arises not only in the context of digital currencies specifically, but in the context of financial regulation generally. And I won't beat around the bush. I mean, my view is that, as I think I made clear at the outset, consumer protection is best achieved by voluntary, innovative, and private processes of the sort that the panel have been talking about. I have to say that I see the existing regulatory structure, and quite possibly any state regulatory structure, or legislative or statutory regulatory structure, whether it comes from the EU or from the UK or from the US, and no matter how well-meaning the individuals who are involved in those processes are, as having fundamental flaws. It's appalling, and I speak partly from a theoretical perspective, but partly from a personal perspective, having advised companies in this area. It's appallingly slow. It doesn't just deal with last year's problems, it's often dealing with last decade's problems.
Last century.
I'm perhaps being kind. It's horrendously expensive. And I've not studied the figures, but if somebody were to sit down and work out the totality of global compliance costs amongst banks, authorised institutions, and just the common user who has to photocopy his passport God knows how many times whenever he does anything that involves an interaction with these systems, those time and money costs must be absolutely vast. Then there's the uncertainty and deterrence, which was mentioned a little earlier. People don't want to go to prison. They don't want to be bothered with those sorts of threats. And the result may often be that things that would have happened simply don't happen at all. Companies that would have started up just give up. And you don't see that. There's no measurement of that, but it's a huge cost. And then there are bureaucratic costs. And there are all the people who work on the regulatory side. They have to be paid. And taxpayers are bearing the cost of that. And then we have, and this I think is a real problem. I think we've now got to a position where financial regulation is taken for granted. There is precious little examination of the underlying assumptions. We hear a lot about money laundering. We hear a lot about terrorists. We hear a lot about consumer protection. But there's not a great deal of consideration as to what this really means, as to how big these risks really are, and as to whether this vast level of cost and deterrence can really be justified when directed at these risks, which are taken for granted, but they're not, I think, seriously evaluated. Now, that's all in a general context. Here, we are dealing with, as Paul said, a very small, and it is a very small industry, which has the potential to be transformative and to make changes that will be hugely positive. I am deeply concerned from a practical and theoretical perspective that it's just going to be squashed and it won't happen, and that many of, or most of, potentially a huge set of benefits will simply never accrue because of the regulatory weight that will be brought to bear, if not now, then in the relatively short term. And that, I think, would be a terrible shame.
Can I just point out that that is the situation from 1994 up to about 2009, series of reports and directives, the e-money directive, is basically European policy that digital cash be squashed. And that has been the case up until the advisal of Bitcoin, which has opened the door to a rethink. And I can tell you the cost. I tried to bring it into Europe and gave up, left.
Yeah. I suspect it was quite a big number.
So,
I suspect it was quite a big number.
May I make a point as well, is that it's all very well to say that it's far too expensive and you have to fill out passport documents several times, and I totally agree with that principle. The fact is, unless we're going to change it, that's the reality that we live with. So at some point, the whole Bitcoin structure, unfortunately, will come under the spotlight. When it does, I suppose, how is it going to be, how do you think the community will deal with it, and how will it, for example, deal with the conduct and information rules, and the investor protection that's coming under, say, MiFID II and so forth. I mean, the community will have to face that at some point, whether it likes it or not, unfortunately.
I think it's important to remember that Bitcoin itself is technology that is designed from the ground up to go resist regulation. You know, it is no accident that the design of it uses proof of work rather than, say, a single centralized server. Precisely because the digital money initiatives between 1995 or so and 2009 used central points of failure. Now this weren't. Now, in terms of failure, I'm not really talking about the technical term failure, as in the sense that the server goes down. That's very easy to engineer out of the equation. It's very easy to create computer systems that have exceptionally high reliability, exceptionally high availability. What's very difficult is to engineer systems where there aren't people who run them, who you can identify and go after. And because Bitcoin allows the people in control of Bitcoin to be agile, and that's set to change over time, these days our expectation, although we haven't seen we don't have good evidence in the sense that this hasn't happened to the degree that it could, but our expectation is if people try to shut down Bitcoin mining operations or try to control them, the agility of the system allows at least some degree of enforcement efforts there to be bypassed by simply going underground, moving to other jurisdictions. That's an explicit part of the design. And there's many things beyond, building from that point that are built into the Bitcoin system. Of course, we're technologists, we're not lawyers. So we're thinking in terms of what technological defenses we have. And I think the discussion will, at least at first, be between legal and regulatory people, with the legal and regulatory people on the other side as to, well, given this reality that we have a system which can go underground to some extent, how are we going to deal with that?
I kind of see it differently, and that's probably because from my angle, what I do as a lawyer is I'm a technology lawyer that helps startups. So what I care about are my clients that have given up their job and have families at home, and they're trying to start a business, to do something innovative. So for me, regulation is complex. It's not simply a matter of the state versus the person. It's also a matter of what regulation can do to facilitate what they're trying to do. Will it help with banking? Will it help increase consumer adoption? How do you get that level without making it so onerous that you don't comply? How do you find a balance between them having to collect data, but then, the onerous, once you've got all that data, you've got your privacy issues as well, and your cybersecurity and stuff. So for me, the complexities of these regulatory questions and the questions about the appropriate framework go beyond just whether or not someone's going to try and shut down the whole network. It's about how this technology has changed the way that different people interact with each other, and how you can try and facilitate the growth of that. And I do come from a jurisdiction that's, made it clear, even the Attorney General's Department who writes the AML laws, if you look at their submission to the Senate inquiry, at the end of it, in the conclusion, the first sentence was, "We see great benefit in this technology." So it doesn't seem like they're trying to shut down Bitcoin. I think they're just trying to make sure people are using this technology wisely.
I should point out, though, that I think we are in agreement. I see that technological defense as how you negotiate from a point of strength, how you have any ability to negotiate at all. Once you have that position, once you can start negotiating, then I think a reasonable regulatory approach and a reasonable society approach would be say, all right, we understand this technology will likely exist. Now we can start having discussion between stakeholders, and they may voluntarily choose to be more in the open, more transparent what we're doing, and also subject to regulation. But because it is a voluntary thing, that is worth it for them to be a part of. But that's always coming from the point of view saying, well, if you choose to kind of say, all right, we will squash this, that is the outcome. And it's much better off if we as a society realize this technology is coming down the pipeline and say, all right, let's figure out how we can work with it.
Yeah, but I think as David mentioned a moment ago, this begs the question of let's reevaluate the policy goals that are underlying AML. Let's really look at it for the first time, because the technology actually allows this despite regulation, and that it is happening. And so when we look at AML and we say, okay, well, how do we regulate Bitcoin, or how do we ensure that companies are collecting the data? The beautiful thing about the resilience of this network is that it allows us for the first time to actually have that conversation. As you said, we can start looking at what are the policy goals behind it, and then stop with this, we just accept that we have to, we need to move from a position of simply accepting the status quo, and we have to start questioning why these regulations are in place anyway, and if they really are about consumer protection. I mean, I don't think anyone in this room is going to say, yeah, I hope to fund terrorism. No one wants that. So we do have common ground, we do have commonality. It's just the broad strokes that have been used in the past to justify this sort of, collection of financial data is, I think, in light of the current technology, an unsustainable viewpoint.
I think we should also remember that most of the world, or a good section of the world, isn't regulated effectively or at all. And that means that this technology can have very rapid impact on a lot of people. It might not have so much, and I mean people. In our jurisdictions, it might have an awful lot of impact on institutions, and perhaps not so quickly on the people, because we are regulated. In many parts of the world, there's no regulation, but this technology can make a great deal of impact to lots and lots of people.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there, Paul, because we look at it from the perspective of the developed Western world, where we have all this. Actually, it is technology-specific regulation. It's the technology of the old type of payments, the traditional payment systems and financial services systems. That is a kind of technology. It was past, sometimes referred to as legacy systems. And actually, all that AML stuff that's enforced today, the various frameworks and the very detailed minutiae of regulation, which is the thing which actually gives rise to all the cost and the inconvenience of having to take your passport and your utility bill and so on and so forth. All that stuff only applies here in the West, and it's an inconvenience to us in the West, and it simply excludes people in the rest of the world from participating in that particular system. But actually, I think that a very good point, I think it was Pamela made earlier on, about Bitcoin actually forcing us to challenge, forcing policymakers to challenge the way that we do it. And I can illustrate that quite simply. I attended a meeting in Brussels last year on the AML challenges of virtual currencies, challenges of virtual currencies on AML. And somebody from the European Commission, that Directorate General that was responsible for AML, had a slide up saying this is how many billion euros last year we estimate was laundered money, and then showed a graph of how successful they've been the previous year over that year over the previous year, the success at stopping or preventing money laundering had increased by 50%, but the actual headline number was a success rate of 0.0 something percent. I don't know, it was insignificant. And I said, look, would you really tell yeah, you're to be congratulated that you're doing your job a little bit better and you've been a bit more successful, but actually, can you just stand back and look at that figure again? Just read that figure to yourself and tell me that that system that you use for regulating is fit for purpose. The frameworks you employ for the old 20th century payments and financial services systems are addressed by legislation that's been updated 2 or 3 times in the 21st century, and all you're doing is tweaking an old system, a legacy system that's clearly, patently not fit for purpose. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in the sense that it doesn't meet those policy aims that maybe sound policy aims, but the systems we employ actually are about legacy systems and legacy methods of solving them. Bitcoin forces that onto the agenda. It forces us, it forces policymakers to stand back and say, hang on a minute, we cannot stop some of this stuff. As Peter said, this stuff is designed to work around those frameworks. So do we bury our head in the sand, or does this start to force a conversation that says we need to stand back and maybe revisit this whole thing, maybe look at it from the point of view of principles rather than minute detail of how to do it. Basically a different approach, and it's a conversation that's needed, and actually it's a conversation that just very slowly is starting. But it might take 10, 20 years to happen.
So on the topic of rethinking traditional policy when it comes to regulating financial institutions, I'm a millennial. I used Napster in high school, and the government shut it down. Right? They were a company that was facilitating widespread copyright theft, right? Copyright infringement, and they smashed it with a hammer. And then my friend Bram invented an algorithm called BitTorrent, where there was no institution running it, it was only the users. And it effectively ended copyright enforcement as we know it, right? Now there's very little risk for anybody downloading a TV show off of the internet, even if HBO hasn't decided to release it yet. And that's just, that practical reality changed. Because like Peter said, the users that wanted to do something that was outside of the policy landscape were suddenly negotiating from a position of strength. Bitcoin, in many, many ways, and related technologies, do the same thing in financial services. We've seen since 2008, the financial industry has not been negotiating from a position of strength. It's been talking to regulators. The regulators have had tremendous power and popularity, cracking down on the most powerful financial institutions in the world, especially in the US and Europe. While Bitcoin's causing us to rethink these things, do we see the fundamentals of how regulators think about financial institutions, how regulators think about the relationship between consumers and companies when it comes to financial services? Do we see room for those to be rethought? And if so, what's the new world going to look like?
I think we do, and I have no philosophical difference with what anyone's saying. I think I'm just probably, I don't know whether the word's pragmatic or cynical, but from my experience, any change to the law moves at a snail's pace. I mean, and that doesn't mean like in 1970 where you wouldn't recognise native title rights, it doesn't mean that you won't 20 years later or 15 years later. I think what I'm trying to do is see an interim thing, and I also disagree that the large part of the world's unregulated. I think they try to have regulations, but it may be ineffective. And why I point this out is because I think what the Philippines is doing with some of their mobile money regulations is interesting, right? What could it look like? Well, they said mobile money from a utility perspective is important in our country. What are some of the barriers to it? Well, KYC, customer due diligence, AML licensing. Okay, what can we do? And in some jurisdictions there where mobile money has a utility, and also what Peter's talking about, which is, I guess it's market force, right? As well as technology, it's market force. They're experimenting with regulatory frameworks that introduce a degree of flexibility. So if you don't have government-backed identification, maybe you have a letter from someone who can vouch for who you are. You know, is this where we ultimately want to end up? No, but if we can, I do think there's hope, because I do think that in certain jurisdictions you've seen some innovative frameworks that have adapted, but they haven't just adapted to force, they've also adapted to the arguments of utility. So it's that, show why you need it, and then show the commercial drivers behind it, and then look at how you can innovate.
Just on that point, in Kenya, M-Pesa used the innovative process of not doing any due diligence at all until the end of 2012, when I arrived there and they asked me for my passport number, which I didn't have, so I gave them a number. 3 months later, it was chopped off, and it had to be handed to somebody else to solve, blah, blah, blah. The point being that they allowed the system to succeed until they reached approximately 80% coverage of the country, and then they allowed the jackals of FATF to come in and impose this KYC/AML, and it's still not imposed. It's only done in Nairobi shops. Out in the regions, they don't care. They sell the phones, and you can get access to money without KYC, without AML, etc., etc. So, what went wrong?
I don't know that anything went wrong as such. Like I said, it's about trying new things. Is it an effective regulatory regime? I also use the word experimental, because I honestly do think that they're trying to understand what they can do as well as much as we're trying to understand what we can do. And so I agree that it doesn't always work. And will it work in the Philippines? I don't know, but it does give me hope that it's not a completely black and white technology versus regulator situation, that there is actually the opportunity to have this dialogue. I could be completely naive, it's highly possible, but it's just what I think.
I suspect the thing we're probably going to see that will be most successful is opt-in regulatory oversight, which really looks like, as a good example, the CCSS cryptocurrency safety standard, security standard,
CCSS.
Which is something where if I am a business in the Bitcoin world, I can go and say, all right, I will go and adhere to the standard, and I will be able to show that my consumers' money is more likely to be safe than if I didn't, or at least I can show that they're more likely to know it's safe. And these are things that regulators can participate in and make sure that good understanding of what the requirements are. Of course, this mainly works in cases where it's in the consumer's best interest to be part of a, if not regulated, a system with oversight and standards. And in the case of KYC and AML, they often have no interest whatsoever. They personally, because identity systems work really well on a voluntary basis, like my earlier example with multisig and PGP. Whereas for the question of, if I give someone my money, will I lose it? That's something where there are very high incentives to make sure that whatever their counterparties are, they have some kind of standard that they adhere to. It may be potentially the case where some forward-thinking regulatory bodies decide, all right, if Silk Road number 8 comes to us and says, we would like to go and participate in this process to ensure that our customer funds are kept safe, they may very well go and say, fine, we would like to help you write that standard, and you're going to adhere to it even though we don't know who you are. I think it's a bit more likely with something like CCSS as a non-government body, but you can certainly see things like that happening, where even if I may not agree with your, what you're doing as business, I can at least agree how you're doing it will have these outcomes.
I'm really pleased that we're onto standards proper here, because, I'll just say a couple of words and then I'll actually tell you what BSI were here to announce. I think the 2-hour overrun beat them. But as part of the UK DCA, we went to the British government and said, look, regulate in this light touch way, and then we will build standards within within the ecosystem, if you like. And that's which if you're talking about regulation, that's great because it's standards give some assurance to people that they're doing the thing the right way. But there's really a very powerful effect of shared standards, standards that have been built, by consensus, which is what BSI are actually here to do. The engineering work that goes into recreating businesses, I'm talking about software engineers working away how to do things. At the moment, we're very young as an industry, so we keep repeating things. Every software engineer really starts rebuilding what somebody else has already built. And it's the parts often that aren't in any way competitive advantage, it's just the nuts and bolts of what we do. And those are the things that really, if we standardize, in fact, if we got around a table and said, look, this is a good way of doing things, so that we can actually rush forward. It's certainly a technique that's been applied in the mobile industry. It used to be a really heavily regulated industry, didn't move anywhere for years, and then suddenly they got standards, and now they're building to the standards that aren't just about to come in, but that have already been pretty well agreed after those. It's a much more dynamic and from an engineering point of view, satisfying environment to exist in. From running a business point of view, it actually de-risks your business a great deal as well. You go off down a particular way of implementing something, and part of the protocol gets changed, and of course you fight it. You fight it tooth and nail, because it could mean the end of your business. So the development of a standard that is open. Now, there's a lot of people in this room that have actually contributed a great deal to starting standards. In other words, agreed ways of going forward. What British Standards we're here to announce was that certainly with the full support of the British government and the UK DCA, we support it as well. In fact, I think we suggested it, that they are going to be running a standards process for digital currencies. It's open to all. Anybody in the world can contribute to it. What they're there to do is actually put a good, well-trodden path to developing an open standard in place. So any standards that exist can be tabled, discussed, adopted if there's consensus. All exactly the same sort of languages we use to administer the Bitcoin infrastructure. So on 21st of July, they're holding a first meeting. Everybody's invited. If they've got any interest at all to contribute to what will be, first of all, British standard, but the British is, it's the first step to an ISO standard, and that's what we're kicking off.
Can I just follow up on what Paul has just said? The great thing about those sorts of standards, voluntary self-regulation in that sense, is that it helps new entrants into the industry. It makes life easier for them. It reduces the costs. It increases competition because it makes the field more open to new entrants, and that's in the interest of consumers. The problem with the sort of regulation that we've seen in the so-called legacy financial industry is that it very often has the opposite effect. Those industries, particularly the banking industry, are to some extent cartelised. There are huge barriers to entry, and those sorts of regulations increase those barriers. They actually make it more difficult for new entrants to come to the field. And the reality is, forget about digital currencies, we don't even know what a modern financial system would look like if those barriers to entry either didn't exist or were hugely reduced. We just don't know.
It's interesting in the Bitcoin core development team how one of the things that's actually happening in terms of standards is, again, because the Bitcoin protocol standard is defined by piece of code, we're taking that piece of code and carefully splitting it out. So if anyone wishes to adhere to the Bitcoin protocol standard, you import this library into your application, and as a software engineer, you will know that you are adhering to the Bitcoin standard. Now that's a very small part of the functionality, but over time that will be increased so that things like, well, are you going to store a key securely? That'll be part of the standard. Implemented in as a piece of code, they can just run, and that's that. And I think that's very interesting just how far opposite it is from this heavy-handed kind of outcomes-based, but how you actually do it is completely ill-defined standards process that we see in finance.
So the collection and popularization of technical standards and business process standards and best practices works really well for some policy goals, right? Like it's among the most effective things we can do to promote innovation, to promote competition, to protect consumers, to reduce barriers to entry. There are a lot of really great effects from that from a policy perspective. But there are some policy goals that aren't helped by that, right? So, for example, anti-money laundering is a policy goal. It's very clear to see why it's in the interest of government, and to the extent that government's in the interest of society, right? Anti-money laundering can help make it more difficult to do business with people who would want to hurt people. Anti-money laundering can help make it more difficult to do business with people who society finds abhorrent, right? It can also help to reduce tax evasion, which reduces funding for public services, right? But because anti-money laundering is fundamentally restrictive on the consumer, it's fundamentally a technology that's intended to reduce the consumer's personal privacy and to restrict the consumer's personal choices. I have a hard time imagining a technical standards process that results in consumer software that is popular, that makes money laundering harder, right? So in a world where consumers are using decentralized technology to interact with financial institutions and interact with each other financially and to contract with each other financially, what's the appropriate approach for the government to pursue its legitimate aims fighting money laundering?
I would go point out that this is like an identical situation to the efforts to combat the use of encryption. Because being able to use encryption makes your communications more secure, it makes your business more secure, it protects you. There's nothing bad about it from a consumer's point of view. And again, every single thing you do to go backdoor encryption, to go make it easier for the police to investigate, make it easier for other countries to investigate you, decreases your security. And there's really no easy way around this. I mean, anything you're going to try to do to tell people to don't use this will result in people finding ways around this. And I suspect the answer may be exactly the same as the answer encryption. At some point, yeah, as a policy goal, you may choose to give up. And you may choose to try to achieve those goals that you wish to achieve in other ways.
It's very easy for governments because the problem with the paraphernalia of anti-money laundering, the passports and the copies and the certified copies and all the other rubbish that inconveniences you, and the fact that it takes in the UK sometimes anything up to 2 or 3 weeks to open a bank account for a regular person just because of all of the processes that have had to be put in place. This has nothing to do with the government. This has to do with banks, who are now the enforcers on behalf of the government, but the consumers don't see that. It's the banks who are to blame. And now here's a thought. We see enterprise, we heard a lot yesterday about private blockchains, we see enterprise moving into the space of virtual currencies and particularly into the space of blockchain, consensus technologies and so forth. So, is big business, are the banks, are the other institutions going to help break down the barriers because of the weight that they carry, or are they going to take over the way that this stuff works simply because they have so much influence and they'll be funding lots of businesses and eventually enforce the restrictive practices that are represented by a lot of the regulatory systems? The incumbents benefit. They're the licensed people. They're the only ones who can transact certain things, do certain stuff. So will they try and take this space over and actually apply indirectly the regulation to this world that we now inhabit? And suddenly we'll find that all this old legacy stuff is applied to the wonderful new crypto world. And how do we stop it?
So we're going to have to call it here and end on that thought. There's more content that Constance and Primavera want to get to. But I just want to thank everybody for coming. This has been the most fascinating panel I've been on in at least a year.
When was the last panel you were on?
I'm on panels every month these days. We're not going to have time to take any more questions from the audience, but everybody on this panel is pretty easily found online, and I think we'd all be interested in continuing these conversations via email.
And we can all be found at the bar as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can I just say that the CCSS standards are open until September for you to comment. Please participate.
Thank you.